honestly, I don't think they could tell the difference between Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, or Afghanistan. Public opinion, by the way, in the United States is dead set against the war. But should U.S. installations be hit, should U.S. service members be killed, then I think that could change instantly.
How bad can things get? Can we get to the point where maybe there'll be even militias attempting to enter Israel?
The people who prosecute these wars are historically, culturally, and linguistically illiterate.
In terms of the resilience, for lack of a better word, that the Pentagon has in terms of trying to just consistently go back into the Middle East and create more disruption.
The message that the genocide in Gaza imparts, in particular to the global South, is that we can do this to you. We will stop at nothing.
Anas, I'm counting myself down and then we'll start. Cool? Okay. 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. And today I'm joined by author, journalist, broadcaster, and Pulitzer Prize winner, Chris Hedges. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Chris obviously is no stranger to a lot of you who are watching this. He's been a very strong and prominent voice for decades, actually, with calling out American power and how it's exercised in many parts of the world, specifically the Middle East. But I mean, he's gained even more prominence since Israel's begun its retaliatory attacks and been sort of devastating and carrying out a genocide in Gaza. Chris, you joined me at a time when there may be World War III on the brink, right? In hindsight, how inevitable was the fact that Netanyahu and Israel were going to launch a retaliatory strike on Iran, or a strike on Iran, post-October 7th?
Well, Israel has been planning for a strike on Iran for years, if not decades. It has invested significant resources, probably billions of dollars, in terms of planning. They have come to the brink of attacking Iran before, but they've always been pulled back from that, usually by the United States. The Trump administration apparently decided to greenlight it. I think that it became, if not inevitable, more and more likely once Israel was able to neutralize Hezbollah in Lebanon and essentially erase it as a threat to northern Israel, decimate Gaza, and certainly weaken Hamas. Hamas is still resisting, but the battalion size or large groups of Hamas fighters no longer exist. Overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The Syrian regime under Assad was a conduit of weapons and supplies to Hezbollah and a bulwark of resistance, especially in terms of supporting the Palestinians. You have seen Israel seize territory in southern Lebanon, in Syria, almost up to the gates of Damascus. They're rapidly emptying northern Gaza and probably, if they can get away with it, which unfortunately I think they can, emptying all of Gaza. They are engaged in pogroms in the West Bank. They've displaced 40,000 Palestinians, seized vast tracts of land in the West Bank, and handed out some 10,000 automatic weapons to Jewish colonists who have formed these rogue militias or death squads that terrorize Palestinians with impunity, and the United States as chief patron does nothing. So when you put all of those together, then it becomes the logical next step to try and attack Iran. Let's be clear that this is not just about neutralizing the Iranian nuclear enrichment program. Nobody, IAEA, nobody, even the U.S. intelligence assessment reports do not claim that Iran is building a nuclear weapon. In fact, quite the opposite. They can't do that without the B-2 bombers and the so-called bunker busters that can penetrate underground. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the Iranian leadership is being decapitated by the Israelis. And so it's clear that this is not just about hindering nuclear enrichment, but also essentially regime change. And the Israelis are doing everything possible to, of course, lure the United States into this project. Indeed, unfortunately, it looks like the Trump administration is certainly on the cusp of carrying out that attack on Fardo, these underground facilities. So I think when you put the kind of steps, or you lay out the steps since October 7th, at least to the Israelis, this was the logical next step.
I mean, we're going to get to what the likely involvement of the U.S. Will be, and I mean, I completely agree. I don't see why the U.S. now and Trump won't go and use the opportunity to try to use the B-52 bombers and take out Fardo. But just, I mean, given what you know about how Israelis normally respond, if you couldn't, I mean, now with hindsight, obviously we know that it's logical left step. But just given Netanyahu's ambition, if someone had to ask you in a snap way, just post October the 7th, do you think Israel's retaliation is going to go beyond Gaza and they take a strike on Iran as well? Then, before we know what's occurred in the last 20 months, would you have been like, yeah, there's a good chance of this, or would it have been something that's would have surprised you completely?
No, on October 7th, I would not have guessed that, because Hezbollah remained a formidable force. Bashar al-Assad was still in power. Hamas was carrying out pretty significant resistance. Israeli casualties, certainly in the first few weeks or months of the genocide, were significant. So no, initially I would not have predicted this. But given all of the steps that Israel took beyond Gaza to neutralize its opposition, then yes, it became, in let's say the last few weeks, not surprising.
Okay, so I mean, you've probably seen the reporting. A lot of people have done reporting on this, but we'll kind of recollect the story for the audience just in case they're not aware of this. But there seems to have been sort of some back and forth between Trump and Netanyahu. Trump was keen on the negotiations occurring and seeing what happens, and Netanyahu was keen on attacking Iran. Netanyahu went ahead. Trump then sort of kind of joined the bandwagon on that. Now it's a clear opportunistic moment, which is not surprising given the Trump administration, given Trump's ego, that he's kind of seeing this as an opportunity. And I think you've mentioned it, and I agree with you entirely, that it's really difficult to see how he won't use this opportunity to take a strike. I think if the intelligence is there, and if they're sure that it won't be an embarrassing moment, and I don't know not much about this, but I don't think Iran will be able to actually deter that strike on the nuclear facility if the US really want to go on it, right? But beyond that, do you see the US going beyond something like that, getting more involved than just taking out Fardo?
That depends on the Iranians. So if there is a strike on Fardo and the Iranians decide to strike against U.S. installations and U.S. bases throughout the region, then the United States will intervene, which is, of course, precisely what Israel wants. I don't see how Iran could not engage in some kind of retaliatory measure if the U.S. joins the war with Israel, which, of course, a bombing strike on Fardo would signal. And then public opinion, by the way, in the United States is dead set against the war. But should U.S. installations be hit, should U.S. service members be killed, then I think that could change instantly. I think people will trot out the flag and start baying for blood, just like they did after 9/11.
Okay, so I mean, the U.S. interventions in the region goes back. I mean, it goes back really since the end of World War II. Coups in Syria, coups in Iran, the Gulf War, Afghanistan. It's not part of the Middle East per se, but it was definitely part of this, an effort to sort of fragment the Arab world, the Muslim world. Interventions in Libya, Syria, interventions in Syria. My own reading, and I mean, this is partly informed by reading some of the things you've written, but other people too, is that the U.S. role in the region is to create chaos. It's to weaken states. How much do you think this is about that, or do you think this is Netanyahu? I mean, yes, he's kind of led us to this brink, or do you think, who do you think's in charge here? Do you think it's the U.S., getting their attack dog to do what they do and letting them roam free, or do you think Netanyahu is literally just dragging the U.S. along here and they're sort of reluctant in this whole development?
Well, it's Netanyahu, the Israel lobby, and the neocons that are pushing Trump into the conflict. They, of course, carried out this bombing strike 2 days before the sixth round of the nuclear talks that the United States had sponsored were to take place. It's not so much that the U.S. wants chaos. What it wants is weak client regimes, which it has throughout the Arab world, or the Muslim world, if you want to include Iran, which isn't Arab, of course. So, just the Iranian history alone is a history of unparalleled aggression on the part of the United States, going back with the coup that overthrew Mossadegh and installed the Shah. The Israelis and the Americans were prime supporters. They trained and equipped the Savak, this savage secret police network under the Shah, and the Shah's regime made war against all sorts of democracy activists. Remember the passenger jet, the U.S. Vincennes, shot down in 1988 as a commercial airliner filled with Iranian civilians. 290 were killed, including 66 children. The U.S. for years has supported, along with Israel, state terrorism, acts of terrorism within Iran that's included suicide bombings, kidnappings, beheadings, sabotage, targeted assassinations of government officials, and of course scientists. We've seen Israel do this now, and Iranian leaders. So there's been a kind of almost de facto war carried out against the Iranian people since the 50s, and against the Iranian regime since the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. This now, of course, raises it to another level, and we didn't even mention the sanctions. But that aggressive posture towards Iran is not new.
Okay, so Israel's kind of quickly moved the goalpost from taking out their defense facilities to taking out their nuclear facilities, to killing various leaders and military and civilian in the Iranian sort of infrastructure and leadership, and also now for regime change, right? Is regime change just a pebble on the path to, and I think you've answered that, to a client regime, but if they were going to undergo some sort of regime change and with US support, what would that look like? How would they even dismantle a state that is as big as Iran, that looks much more challenging, much more formidable than Iraq did 20 years ago? How would they go about doing that? And would it be essential then for the US to kind of deploy boots on the ground?
Well, it won't work. I mean, if there's any lesson from all of these failed military debacles that have been carried out in the last 20 years, is that they don't work. Whether that's in Libya, which with the death of Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear program, by the way, and ended up dead in a ditch. The intervention in Iraq essentially turned the Iraqi government over to the Shia. The Shias, of course, are a majority in Iraq, about 60% of Iraq, allied with Iran. Syria is a failed state. Lebanon is, pretty close to a failed state. And it doesn't work. It's catastrophe after catastrophe, both in terms of U.S. and Israeli intervention. So you're asking how it will work. The short answer is it won't. It will create all sorts of untold problems and chaos. Remember, including, of course, our intervention spawned the rise of these radical extremist groups like ISIS, and there were moments in that period when we were arming groups like that. It just becomes a complete mess once you open that Pandora's box of war. I spent 20 years covering wars around the globe. It controls you. You don't control it. And I think that attempt, I think there is a very clear attempt at regime change, is going to spell disaster for Iran, disaster for Israel, disaster for the United States, and disaster for the region.
So, just absolutely agree with you, and we've seen this happen, as you mentioned, a few times. But in a way, when empires want to expand, right, maybe their loss is very big and significant, but if they've weakened their opponents more, then it's a victory, right? And I think there's a common assertion that yes, the U.S. had a disaster in Iraq and they've had a disaster in Afghanistan, and we know that the bigger loser are Iranian societies and Iraqi societies and Afghan societies, and maybe that is what their goal is, just to sort of weaken the society. And from Israel's sort of sustainability perspective, when I say sustainability, I mean sustainable in the short term, having weak states who are client regimes, who are always recuperating from wars and devastation, does suit them. So do you think, I mean, now again with hindsight and the way that Netanyahu's kind of started this first with dealing with Gaza and blowing it to smithereens, committing a genocide, annihilating it, taking out Hezbollah. I think what he didn't factor in was that by taking out Hezbollah, he kind of made it very easy for the sort of Syrian rebels to take control of Damascus, and that's now a new problem that he faces. And he's been striking on Syria, and he's been trying to carve that up by supporting the Kurds in the north and having them supporting their initiative to have an independent state, etc. But I mean, do you think this has been kind of like, I mean, from a nihilistic point of view, it's almost perfect execution from his perspective on how he's conducted this war, from a completely amoral, perspective. Do you think this has been his plan?
Yeah, I mean, Iran is the last linchpin. What they did by invading Iraq is upset the traditional power balance within the Middle East between Iran and Iraq. Iraq is now essentially allied with Iran. Its Shiite-dominated government is allied with Iran. But, as you point out correctly, the 20-year occupation of Iraq devastated the country, its infrastructure, degraded its military capabilities, and that is what Israel wanted. And, of course, they want to do the same thing with Iran. I think we also want to be clear that the fiascos that the neoconservatives and the Zionists have orchestrated throughout the Middle East have never gone according to plan and created one mess after another. These people are not about to accept responsibility for what they have done. In fact, of course, all the old cheerleaders for the war, John Bolton and Max Boot, all of these people who sold us the war, Mark Levin and Newt Gingrich and Sean Hannity and Thomas Friedman and David Frum, who peddled the lies that got us into the war in Iraq, are now on the airwaves peddling equally mendacious scenarios to lure us into a war with Iran. And I think a lot of it is because they finally are looking for a scapegoat and have been looking for a scapegoat for a long time, and Iran is it. So in their fantasy-driven world, they somehow believe that if they can take out the regime in Tehran, they can fulfill that utopian dream of theirs to remake the Middle East, which was always a non-reality based form of magical thinking, the idea that Baathists in Iraq would greet us as liberators, or democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, or the oil revenues would pay for the reconstruction, all of which they told us at the time, all of which turned out, of course, to be false. They have essentially projected this kind of utopian fantasy now on removing the government in Tehran and dominating Iran.
I mean, how do you feel the client Arab regimes are feeling right now? I mean, last April, when the Israelis killed the Iranian officials in Damascus, and Iran responded with retaliatory strikes, you saw sort of a lot of diplomacy happen between the Arab states and Iran. They've just sort of serenaded Trump with over $4 trillion, mainly, I would guess, to sort of make sure that he kind of, doesn't sort of blow things up in the region. How do you think they're feeling right now?
Well, The problem, and this goes back to the genocide, the problem isn't in the end that Israel is strong. Israel only has 10 million people. The problem is that the Arab regimes are weak, with what, 480 million people. And they have been successfully broken and domesticated primarily by the United States. And so they've not responded to the genocide. They're passive observers. I mean, countries like Saudi Arabia, of course, and others have issued statements opposing the strikes on Iran, but they've been neutered. They're not capable. They're impotent. They're not capable of doing anything. The only country that's responded in any meaningful way to the genocide is Yemen. And then, of course, both the U.S. and Israel has been bombing the hell out of Yemen. But the Arab regimes are prostrate. They are completely. They've become completely captive. And I would go back to the Arab nationalist movement under Gamal Abdel Nasser and the non-aligned movement that he made with Nehru and Tito. I don't think the genocide would have happened. But there's no counterweight. There's no counterweight to Israel. And then we should also be clear, the Israel lobby owns the U.S. Congress. Many of the things that Israel does, I would argue, of course, including inciting a war with Iran, are not in the interest of the United States. The invasion of Iraq was certainly not an occupation in the interest of the United States, but it was in the interest of Israel. And unfortunately, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is completely captive to the Israel lobby. I mean, that's how you get Netanyahu, who's an indicted war criminal for war crimes and crimes against humanity, being invited to the Congress, and Congress people can't leap to their feet fast enough to give him a standing ovation. So the Israel lobby has effectively captured U.S. foreign policy, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. You can't defy it. Biden didn't defy it. The rhetoric between Biden and Trump is different, but the unflinching, unwavering support for the genocide is the same.
Just, I mean, more specifically, I mean, the Iranians have said that they will retaliate by attacking U.S. bases. A lot of them are in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in these states, and they've also, threatened to blow up oil facilities, plunging, and that will definitely plunge the region into some sort of war, conflict of some sort. How nervous are they? I mean, at the same time, they probably know that they're powerless to open up diplomatic channels with Trump. Given that they kind of did do this massive diplomatic move just 3 or 4 weeks ago when Trump was on his tour of the Middle East. So just, I mean, there's definitely the fact that they've been complicit in the genocide, and we'll get to that. But just how do you think how nervous are they right now, and what are they processing?
Well, I'm sure they're nervous, but there's an unknown factor, and that is how degraded is Iran's defensive capabilities. How many of these missile sites which Israel targeted in the first wave of attacks have been destroyed? They've targeted others since. How many missiles do they have? I think the assumption is they have about 2,000 ballistic missiles. Do they still have 2,000? Those are unknown questions. And eventually they're going to run out. I would add, in the same way that Israel and the U.S. will run out of interceptors under the Iron Dome and THAAD missiles and everything else. And those are unanswerable questions. We are seeing more ballistic missiles penetrate Israel's defensive surface-to-air system, which is interesting. But we don't know how much is left in their arsenal. It does seem that Israel, and then we talk about air defenses, because Iran never had much of an air force. I mean, some of its warplanes date back to the Shah. I mean, but they were always assumed to have fairly decent air defense systems, largely Russian, some Chinese. Those have proved utterly ineffective, either because we miscalculated in terms of the efficacy of those systems, or, and we know Israel did target them in the first wave, Israel was able to essentially destroy them. These are all unknown. So I think we have to ask ourselves, if there is a U.S. strike, what the capacity of Iran, at least in the short term, is to retaliate. They may not have much to retaliate with.
I mean, you've mentioned Russia and China. Do you think they will show some sort of substantive support to Iran? I mean, I know it's an unknown, but just what's your speculative thoughts on that?
I think Russia will probably, but again, in order to replenish these weapon systems, that takes time. That's not done quickly. So I'm not sure in the short term Iran is in a great position. But it certainly wouldn't surprise me if Russia, which has built a strong alliance with Iran, would at least seek to replenish its military stockpiles in the same way that the United States continually replenishes the weapons and stockpiles that Israel uses not only to carry out the genocide in Gaza, but its offensive operations in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran.
Okay, so I mean, when we bid to speak to you about 2 weeks ago, there wasn't yet an Israeli strike on Iran. I mean, in the most recent sense, and we were mainly going to speak about Gaza. And it was in the wake of you writing a very sort of powerful article about Gaza, which we'll bring up now, which read, "We, full participants in this genocide, will have achieved or demented our demented goal of emptying Gaza and expanding Greater Israel. We will bring down the curtain of the limestone genocide. We will have mocked the ubiquitous university programs of Holocaust studies designed, it turned out, not to equip us to end genocide, but deify Israel as an eternal victim, licensed to carry out mass slaughter. The mantra of never ever, never again is a joke." How do you? I mean, there's many other powerful things you wrote in that article. Just what's your thoughts on how so many parties have been able to sort of collaborate with each other to be complicit in this genocide?
Right, you're quoting from this article called "The Last Days of Gaza," which is
Yes.
on my Substack, chrishedges.substack.com. Well, I mean, this isn't something that's easy for me to write. I spent significant time in Gaza, 7 years in the Middle East, of course. Much of that time in Gaza. I mean, I was based and lived in Gaza. I've not only lost friends and colleagues, but is more common, and I think that's true for many people who have relationships with people in Gaza, they've just disappeared. We heard from them sporadically every few weeks, and then we just don't hear from them at all. Since March 2nd, Israel has orchestrated mass starvation along with everything else. And unless there is a lifting of that siege and food is allowed in, and let's be clear, they're very cynically named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is just a ruse. It doesn't pretend to offer anywhere near enough food or aid hubs to cater to this over 2 million people, at least 500,000 of whom are now on the brink of starvation. It's a way to lure them into southern Gaza. Every day there are riots, which is fine with Israel, and upwards of 1, 2, 3 dozen people are wounded and killed in the attempt to get these meager food packets. Very cynical. It's all built along, of course, the border, the 9-mile border near Rafah, the 9-mile border with Egypt, and it's designed to lure people down to the south and contain them in guarded compounds, concentration camps, whatever you want. And I would argue probably at a certain point, as that humanitarian crisis becomes more acute, to breach parts of that fence. I've been there, of course, with the Egyptian border. It is just a fence, to breach it and allow desperate Palestinians to flee into the northern Sinai. Israel has threatened this many times. The Egyptian government has warned that they won't allow it to happen. But at this point, given Israeli hubris and given Israelis' perpetual violation of international law and its military prowess, I don't know how much Israel could or Egypt could do to prevent it. But the situation in Gaza is, there's no clean water. 90% of the Palestinians in Gaza are living either in the open air or in crude tents or amid the rubble. Nothing works. I mean, even the emergency vehicles can't get fuel, so there are no ambulances, no bakeries. I mean, it's devastated. It's meant to be devastated, and the Western governments, the United States and Europe, have been completely complicit in carrying out now 20 months of this live stream genocide. But the Palestinians, and I'm not, they don't want to anyway take away the heroism of the Palestinians, but they can't take much more. I mean, they've reached a breaking point. And I think part of the war with Iran is a way to divert attention from what's happening in Gaza and probably in the West Bank, but certainly in Gaza. I mean, the Israelis, if you notice, have been cutting off the internet for extended periods of time, so there's no communication at all. And the worst ethnic cleansing campaigns carried out by the Zionists, by Israel, have always occurred during wartime, always under the auspices of quote-unquote liberal Zionists. So 1948, not only with all of the massacres at Deir Yassin and everywhere else, but you had 750,000 Palestinians driven from their homes in historic Palestine. And then again in the 1967 war, you had 350,000 Palestinians driven from their homes. So, of course, in between these conflicts, there was a slow motion ethnic cleansing. But now involved in another war, I think that Israel will clearly see that as an opportunity to replicate the kind of massive ethnic cleansing or expulsions that took place in 48 and 67.
You've kind of spoken about what I wanted to speak to about again, about how they're going to use this war as sort of disguise to ramp up, if it's possible to ramp up the ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. But I mean, it's honestly, if the U.S. and Israel get embroiled in a war in Iran that lasts any amount of time of substance, I find it difficult to even imagine that the West Bank will kind of remain. It's not intact at all, but the West Bank could be devastated as well if unfortunately this timeline goes on and there's some sort of long drawn out war, which I'm sure Netanyahu is trying to achieve. So it really is I mean, quite devastating, as you've mentioned. The Arab world, we've mentioned their complicity. Please feel free to kind of tell us more about their complicity. But the question I want you to answer is, for how much longer do you think the Arab world, the populations, are sort of going to be able to, they've got their own challenges, they have their own regime puppets and suppression that they kind of need to face. But I mean, is there going to be some sort of uprising, explosion? Do you feel, I know these things are again difficult to predict, but I mean, surely this can't be, I mean, I don't think the leaders are very comfortable, and I'm sure the people, while they have their own challenges, are very, very frustrated.
Yeah, I mean, so I just came back from Egypt. This is my third visit to Egypt. I've been in Qatar twice. I was in the West Bank, in Jordan last summer. There's no question that on the Arab street, the population is enraged and legitimately enraged, not only at the genocide, but at the kind of tacit complicity of their own governments. This was especially true in Jordan because once Yemen disrupted the maritime traffic, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan set up a land corridor that supplied Israel with the goods that it could no longer get through shipping. And in fact, the Palestinian journalists who exposed it got thrown in prison for a year. So yes, I think what would be the trigger would be the actual expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. That might break these very fragile regimes, but these countries, they don't do much very well. But the one thing they do well is administer a police state, and their internal security is formidable and brutal, whether that's in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, or anywhere else. So to speak out against the genocide comes with tremendous risks in these countries. But I think that if we began to see Palestinians expelled into the northern Sinai, or, perhaps even into Jordan from the West Bank, this might be the breaking point. And I think these regimes fear that, and I think they're right to fear it. So if that happens, yeah, I think that the popular discontent could boil over into something more significant. But my guess is that would be the breaking point.
I mean, you may or may not have seen, but there's kind of these clips that have been gone viral in the last few days of Israeli TV presenters sort of joking among themselves that they've beaten Gaza in the quarterfinals, they're going to beat Iran in the semifinals, and in the finals they're going to meet Turkey. Can you explain to us sort of like the geopolitical connect that they have in their minds when they say that?
Well, that shows how clueless they are. I mean, having lived in Israel and then having lived in the Arab world, I'm well aware of how the disdain by which Israelis look at Arabs and Muslims, coupled with unparalleled hubris and arrogance, uh, bolstered by a very sophisticated military, which is, of course, sustained and funded in large part by the United States. So when these all of these factors combine, you get overreach. I mean, going against Turkey would definitely be overreach, but I think probably going against Iran is overreach in the long term. In the short term, Israel can inflict a lot of damage in the same way the United States inflicted a lot of damage in the short term in Iraq, in the short term in Afghanistan. In the long term, these were debacles. And I think the same will be true in Iran. You asked earlier about boots on the ground. Right now, the Israelis and the Americans believe that they can break the regime through aerial assaults. They weren't able to break ISIS through aerial assaults. They finally had to build Kurdish forces to go in and occupy the caliphate. So I think if you reached a point of frustration or a stalemate, and you put remember, Iran is a huge country. It's the size of Western Europe. It's the 17th largest country in the world. Population of 90 million. That's almost 10 times the population of Israel, which has about 10 million. It would take 1 million U.S. troops at least to occupy Iran, and it would go about as well as the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq went. Once these wars begin, you don't control them; they control you. I know. I've covered war after war, and you become hostage to that kind of centrifugal force of war that pushes you in all sorts of directions, including directions you may not want to go. And we saw that in the 20 years of U.S. intervention in the Middle East. And we would definitely see it should a full-scale war erupt with Iran.
So you mentioned history, and you've obviously been covering the region for decades. You were arrested in 1990 by the U.S. Army for refusing to be part of their press corps. Shortly after the war, the New York Times appointed you their bureau chief in the region. You've also covered since then, a bunch of other wars. You've covered the Yugoslavia splitting into Bosnia and Serbia, and the wars that occurred because of that. Can you just sort of give us some anecdotes from that time, from that period, which are kind of informative to us in terms of how this is playing out, and again, the illusions of grandeur that these Western powers, specifically the U.S. and Israel, also have about how they can change things, but also sort of on in terms of the resilience, for lack of a better word, that the Pentagon has in terms of trying to just consistently go back into the Middle East and create more disruption, more loss for them, and even greater loss for the people in the region.
Well, let's begin. The people who prosecute these wars are historically, culturally, and linguistically illiterate. Honestly, I don't think they could tell the difference between Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, or Afghanistan. They don't have a plan. Ultimately, we saw that with the chaos that erupted in Iraq. They fired all the Baathists and demobilized the military. And what they did was spawn a very virulent insurgency. And let's be clear, in order to beat back the Sunni insurgency, they brought in Iranian militias on Iraqi soil that tacitly worked as an ally with the United States. I mean, it's interesting that Iran and the United States have common enemies, including the Taliban, including Al-Qaeda. So you see the same with Iran. I don't sense that there's any long term planning. I mean, should, for instance, the Iranian government become decapitated? Should Iran carry out significant damage against American installations and military bases? And we haven't even talked about the Strait of Hormuz, that very narrow, I think it's 33 kilometers wide. Iran can very easily mine that narrow strip and seriously disrupt. I think about 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, especially since the Israelis are targeting Iranian oil facilities. There's more and more incentive for the Iranians to shut down, or at least that shut down that kind of chokehold. And at that point, global oil prices would double, if not triple. I mean, and then you have all the other maritime traffic that has to go through the Strait of Hormuz. So there's lots of ways, and then you have unconventional warfare. You have suicide attacks. You have acts of quote unquote terrorism carried out against Western interests. It can get really, really, really messy. And I don't sense that either Israel or the Trump administration as in any way prepared any more than the Americans prepared for what they inevitably had to face in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where they lost both of those wars.
You mentioned earlier on that sort of in the long term, this would be devastating for the Americans and the Israelis, and I mean, Iran, they financed and organized militias in Iraq during the Iraq Civil War, which lasted almost a decade. The Syrian Civil War also, there were many, besides Hezbollah, there were many Iranian militias or Iraqi militias funded by Iran that entered Syria, etc. Just how bad you've kind of touched on it, but how bad can things get? Can we get to the point where maybe there'll be even militias attempting to enter Israel? Is this something the Israelis, you think, are even, they can conceive of? And I mean, that would, how bad can things get?
Well, they can get really, really, really bad, and they can get really, really messy if this becomes a regional conflict. I have my doubts that Iranian-inspired militias will enter Israel. Israel is a very small and compact country with very well-guarded borders. I mean, you've seen, obviously, Israeli commandos able to enter Iran. Well, Iran is a big country and its border is porous. That's not true with Israel. But if the United States goes to war, then quote-unquote, Western interests, American interests, anywhere in the world become legitimate targets. So this can, and I think that there's a real possibility that if the United States attacks Iran, certainly significant numbers of Shia will interpret this as a war against Shiism, which is, of course, the second largest offshoot or sect of Islam. You have 2 million Shia in Saudi Arabia, many living in the eastern oil-rich region. Iraq, as I said before, is predominantly Shia, significant Shiite populations in Bahrain, in Turkey. And should that happen, should this be interpreted by Shiites as a war against Shiism, you can create all sorts of conflagrations far from the periphery of Iran that begin to really hobble and cripple American power.
In 2003, when the Iraq War was starting to unfold, you left the New York Times after you criticized at a graduation commencement speech. You criticized the U.S. invasion. There were boos and jeers in the crowd against you. We've seen in the last 20 months lots of graduation speeches where students are speaking out against the genocide. They're saying free Palestine, and they're being applauded. I mean, not always. I'm sure they're being jeered as well. But how has the atmosphere changed, you think, in terms of people power and people resistance and people consciousness in 2003 compared to now?
Well, the genocide has no popular support. At best, people are passive, but it's a tiny minority of fanatical Zionists who support it. That's the difference. After 9/11, the United States drank, that very dark elixir of nationalism and, that lust for retribution and revenge. So to speak out against the call to invade Iraq was fighting against the tide of popular opinion. Indeed, when I would come back to my office at the New York Times, my phone bank was filled with death threats. And the only reason I didn't get more is because the capacity of the phone bank to record messages ran out. That is a big difference. And I think we should also note that there's no popular support for a war with Iran, either in the UK or the US, but that doesn't matter. I think that if there is a retaliatory strike, if US service members are killed, then that will instantly, like the flick of a switch, see everybody, bring out the flag and bay for blood. But right now, there's almost no support. I mean, I forget the latest polls, but I think it's upwards of 70%. People do not want to go to war with Iran, and a significant percentage of those people are Trump supporters in his MAGA base.
How do you think this war? I mean, if there is a war and it is extended, how do you think it's going to split American politics? Let's talk about Trump and the MAGA base, but also, I mean, the Democrats and sort of the liberal establishment has been left, decrepit. There's no one really representing them. They don't really have a voice. So how is it going to impact all of these movements, including the progressive movement, which now, includes people outside sort of the two parties, but even people like Mahmoud Mamdani, who's been very sort of eloquent and articulate about speaking unapologetically almost about what's happening in the region. How do you think it's going to sort of splinter American politics?
It would splinter American politics. The Democratic Party is largely the war party. There's been more opposition to our military adventurism and involvement in foreign wars in the Republican Party than, in fact, in the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party leadership anyway, is solidly behind Israel. Schumer and these figures have always been fervent supporters of the Zionist project. But you are seeing within the lower levels of the Democratic Party, and as I mentioned before, in significant segments of the so-called MAGA base, opposition to war, another war. And of course, this was J.D. Vance, the vice president's mantra before the election. He himself had served in Iraq. So I believe it was Iraq or Afghanistan, I can't remember. So I think it would really splinter the American landscape. The Democratic Party is largely a corpse. It has about a 27% approval rating. It has failed utterly to respond in a meaningful way to Trump's rapid consolidation of authoritarianism. They think that they lost the election because of messaging, not because they sold out the American working class through NAFTA and other trade deals that resulted in 30 million mass layoffs. This was triggered by the Clinton administration, the Democratic Clinton administration. I think it really would create deep divisions, and not necessarily along party lines, but deep divisions within the political landscape of the United States. But let's be clear that the Trump administration has used draconian forms of control to shut down dissent, including throwing U.S. senators to the ground and handcuffing them, or they just did this to a mayoral candidate, throwing judges in jail. There is largely an absence of the rule of law. Judges who find or present rulings contravening Trump's orders are ignored because the Department of Justice under Pam Bondi, all of these departments have been turned over to these mediocrities and sycophants, won't enforce it. So and we've of course seen the U.S. Marines deployed on the streets of Los Angeles. ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency, is grabbing legal residents with green cards, and they show up in unmarked cars, masked, without identifying themselves, and arresting and deporting them. So if these divisions began to be expressed in terms of political discontent that the Trump administration found threatening, all of these measures would be employed, even against dissenters, even if they were within the MAGA base.
Given what you've just said, and I mean the sort of the what we've seen in LA with the protests and stuff, that I mean it's completely disconnected from Iran. It started well before that, and it's kind of way. I mean it's maybe tangentially related to foreign policy on Gaza, but it really isn't, right? Just given already the internal discontent, what do you think? I mean, what do you think the U.S. looks like after the Trump administration, or is there an end to the Trump administration?
I think this is the end. The descent into kind of police state began long before Trump. The capture of democratic institutions by corporations and the billionaire class began long before Trump. The reconfiguration of the machinery of government to essentially funnel money upwards into the hand of the billionaire class began long before Trump. The evisceration of civil liberties, due process, the right to privacy began long before Trump. So all of the mechanisms were there, essentially allowing Trump with ease to create a police state. I think the United States is not going back from this. Who will be the public face of it after Trump? I don't know. But American democracy, which was in deep decay, is now on life support, and that's probably being generous.
Do you think AIPAC will, into the future, will have as much influence as they've had, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, because it's all about money. So our political system is one of legalized bribery. Politicians dance to the tune of the highest donor or highest bidder. Whether that is corporate America or the war industry or the Israel lobby. So given that, as long as you have money, and the Israel lobby has a lot of money, that they will not only use to support people who do Israel's bidding, but of course defeat people like Jamal Bowman. I think they put $11 million in his House campaign to see him defeated, to go after people who stand up for Palestinian rights or decry Israel's capture, at least in terms of foreign policy, of American political power. I mean, we've seen it on the universities. The demonization of students, I'm guessing 20-30% of whom are Jewish, as Hamas supporters and anti-Semites, is absurd. I spent time at these encampments at Columbia and Princeton and other places. It was a complete misrepresentation of those who were protesting the genocide. But these universities became completely complicit in giving credence or giving credibility to a problem that didn't exist. And I've taught at Columbia, I've taught at Princeton, I've taught at New York University, I did my graduate work at Harvard. The idea that these places are bastions of anti-Semitism is ridiculous and absurd. But in bending over backwards to cater to the Zionist lobby, these institutions gave credibility to that narrative, and it's now been turned against them. So in essence, they kind of handed the bullets to their own executioners. In their failure was that they didn't grovel enough. You saw it with the college presidents who went down before Congress. They didn't get up and speak a truth, which is that Israel is committing genocide and Israel is an apartheid state. They slavishly repeated the lines handed to them by the Zionist lobby and by their billionaire supporters. They just didn't do it obsequiously enough, and so they were gotten rid of. I mean, Columbia has given the Trump administration, or conceded every demand that the Trump administration imposed upon Columbia in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, and including putting Middle Eastern departments in receivership and purging students and professors, including figures like Catherine Franke at the law school, for speaking out against the suppression of students. And it didn't make any difference. And now the Trump administration is threatening to remove their accreditation. Same was true with Harvard. So these institutions, all of the democratic institutions, haven't gotten into the press, have collapsed. They don't work anymore. I mean, the fact that the press is running around amplifying the voices of these old warmongers from the war in Iraq, who are reading from exactly the same script, they're just substituting Iran for Iraq, just shows you how, the kind of deep rot within the American system.
I mean, is there any progressives or anything on the horizon that maybe inspires some hope? I mean, Bernie Sanders took a very long time to even call for a ceasefire when this genocide began. He now has been more outspoken, but there was very poor form from him. AOC was often harangued for not using the genocide word. She's now endorsed Mamdani, who doesn't use the genocide word, but does speak very forcefully against Israel and sort of U.S. interventionism in a negative way in the region, and also for progressive values locally. Do you see any change occurring, or I mean, do you think Mamdani is up to the task at some point if he gets elected? How do you see this playing out?
Well, let's be clear: the progressive figures like AOC get a lot of press, but they're utterly powerless. They're a tiny, tiny minority. They don't even represent probably 1 or 2% of the American political establishment, and in a way, nobody really cares what they say or what they think. The only way to fight back against this rapidly consolidated police state that Trump is imposing on us are mass mobilization, and that doesn't mean going out on a No Kings rally in your park. It means strikes, it means disrupting the system, shutting down the system, largely done through labor. Without that, I don't see any impediments to where we're headed. I certainly don't think that progressive forces are going to make any difference without the power of mass movements behind them. And history has kind of shown that over and over again. You have figures like Shama Sawan, the socialist city councilwoman, who's trying to organize militant or radical labor movements in her No Strike Back or Worker Strike Back program. But these are, we're almost beginning from scratch. I mean, American labor has been completely defanged. Only about 11% of the workforce is unionized, and I think about 6% of that are state employees who legally can't strike. We saw it a couple of years ago with the railroad freight workers. They were blocked from striking under law by Biden. So unless we can begin to seriously disrupt the system through mass movements, I don't think there's any way we can halt the trajectory that we're headed towards, which is happening with alarming speed towards a kind of despotism or Christian fascism or whatever it is you want to call it.
Just want to speak about journalism for a while. I mean, you've always kind of practiced and operated as a journalist that's had friction with the establishment. This is from your very early days. But when you compare the states of journalism now in the USA, or actually globally, when you look at the cover that's been given for the genocide by many outlets, and you compare that to cover previously in the Iraq War in 2003, how do you think the states of journalism has changed? Do you think it's just always? Do you think it's equally bad, or do you think it's much worse? It's more captured by sort of interests and journalists just have no fangs. Just how do you? I mean, you've had a problem with it all along, but do you think it's actually reached a new low?
Yeah, I think it's worse, but I want to make it clear that every time a country goes to war, the journalists fall in line and essentially act or do their part for the country to cheerlead the war and perpetuate the narrative imposed by the war makers. That's true in every war. It was true in Vietnam at the inception. It changed, of course. It was true in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, everywhere else. So that's the nature of journalism, that it's a reactive force. So when popular opinion is behind a war or a move, it won't challenge it. So, for instance, the coverage changed in the Vietnam War or in the Iraq War when popular opinion changed. That said, journalism itself has changed its entity from when I began as a journalist covering the war in El Salvador in the early 1980s. In that time, you had large media enterprises that sought to reach a very broad population. The New York Times, you had 3 major networks, 4 if you want to count CNN. Now, 2 things happened. One, with the internet, that sellers didn't need the medium of journalistic outlets to reach buyers. They all have our profiles. They can reach us directly. You saw with the loss of classified advertising in terms of newsprint that was 40% of newspaper revenue. So right there, newspaper revenue slashed almost in half. Um, and and so these entities began to atrophy. How did they respond to the plethora of outlets that are available on the internet, which are largely echo chambers for whatever it is you believe? They too siloed themselves and catered to a particular demographic. So the New York Times, where I worked for 15 years, caters to liberal Democrats. We know because when they do surveys, it's like 94% or something vote Democrat. MSNBC, the same. Fox News caters obviously to a Republican base. But the problem with that is that when you silo to that base, then you attempt to feed that base what it wants to hear. So after Trump was elected the first time, digital subscriptions to the New York Times exploded. And the New York Times knew from surveys that people took out those subscriptions because they hated Trump. So they fed them for 2 years the fantasy of Russiagate, the idea that Trump was a Russian asset, all of which was completely exposed as a myth by the Mueller report, but they didn't pay a price for it because that's what their readership and their subscriber base wanted to hear. Now that makes commercial sense, but it degrades. It doesn't make journalistic sense. And so as you had that reconfiguration, the kind of range of acceptable opinion within a newsroom narrowed. I mean, I worked for 2 decades as a mainstream journalist. I was a management headache. They weren't going to make me the editor of a paper or even an editor, but that space is closed. All of that said, by the way, the New York Times was never good on Israel, ever, for other reasons. I mean, the media landscape has, I mean, the coverage of the encampments, it wasn't even, I've taught journalism. I mean, if some student came in and told me that all of the students in the encampment in Colombia were Hamas supporters, I would ask, well, where's the evidence? Where do you find it? The New York Times, when they reported on these encampments, sent reporters up to the Hillel house to find some Jewish Zionist and they never make a distinction, by the way, between Jews and Zionists, who was made to feel uncomfortable. Meanwhile, 108 Columbia students, many of whom were Jewish, were thrown in jail by the New York City police that was invited onto the campus to arrest people who were carrying out peaceful protest. The press is, the coverage on Gaza has been horrific. The coverage on the protests has essentially served to demonize the students and the few faculty who have stood up. And that's part of the problem. And the press itself is a shadow of what it once was. It was never, the commercial press always had terrible flaws. That's another show. But it was better. And now it's almost a joke.
You mentioned that the New York Times always has had bad coverage of Israel and Palestine. Why is that so?
Well, because much of its advertising base and much of its readership and a significant number of people who run the paper are very sympathetic to the Zionist narrative. The executive editor, Joe Lelyveld, when I was hired at the paper, his father was a rabbi who ran Hillel, was a strong Zionist. So, and that's also true, by the way, in the current executive editor. His father is, I think he's involved in camera. The Times has always had a strong allegiance to Zionism. And the way they did it when I covered Gaza, the way they would neuter my story, Israel would carry out what they called a surgical strike on a bomb-making factory. You can't make this stuff up. And then I would go to a refugee camp like Jabalia and look at all the bodies of the children. And the way that they would neuter it is that even though the Israeli spokespeople were not there, every other paragraph, even though I was interviewing eyewitnesses or writing about what I saw, every other paragraph would be handed over to the Israeli military, the IDF spokespeople, to essentially counter what it was that I had written. So by the end of the story, you can believe whatever you want to believe. Now, I want to be clear, that did not happen to me when I covered other conflicts like Bosnia. It didn't. I mean, it was also the fact that you have numerous reporters who work out of the Jerusalem Bureau whose children serve in the IDF. I mean, this is staggering. And they never wanted to go to Gaza. So, I mean, I speak Arabic. They didn't speak Arabic, but I was based in Cairo. I was constantly sent to Gaza because they wouldn't go. And I will, to be fair to the New York Times, they ran my stories. They ran them, often on the front page. But yeah, the Times has always had that in terms of foreign policy, its Achilles heel has always been Israel.
Chris Hedges, we have two more questions, so thank you so much for your time. But just hang in there; it's not much longer to go. You've spent a lot of almost your whole career basically writing critically of U.S. foreign policy. If you were put in charge of U.S. foreign policy right now, what would you do?
I'd withdraw all military forces from the Middle East. I would end the support for client regimes, dictators, or monarchies that are, in essence, dictatorships, to allow the people in the Middle East to breathe and to achieve their democratic aspirations that we have thwarted for decades. I would close we have 100 military bases. I mean, the empire is a virus. It's destroying, of course, and inflicting tremendous suffering on the rest of the world, but it's also destroying the United States internally. The United States physically is collapsing. Its infrastructure is broken and doesn't work. It's probably 60% of the population is living paycheck to paycheck. And of course, with the suppression of wages, people are really struggling. That's how you see this anger that gave rise to the election of a demagogue like Trump. All of the mechanisms of control used to subjugate people on the outer reaches of empire, wholesale surveillance, militarized drones, militarized police, etc., have migrated back to the United States. They may have been tested out on Palestinians or people of color, but now they're being used, well, in Los Angeles, once again, on people of color, or during the George Floyd protests against people of color. But that's what happens. I mean, that empires hollow themselves out from the inside. It's what Thucydides noted in his History of the Peloponnesian War, where he wrote that the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. So not only is the empire, the American empire, doing tremendous harm and inflicting grievous suffering and death on people outside the borders of the United States, but is also calcifying the United States and creating a very despotic and very ugly police state internally, with all of the mechanisms that are very familiar to those the empire controls overseas.
I mean, I'm assuming among those things you listed was obviously, withdrawing military aid and support for Israel and not taking a strike on Iraq. I mean, on Iran.
No, Israel. Yeah, that goes without saying. I've been a supporter of the boycott and sanction movement since its inception. Israel is an apartheid genocidal state that has to be treated the same way the apartheid regime in South Africa was treated. That's absolutely key. I don't see the U.S. government, at least in the short term, carrying out those kinds of sanctions, but that's certainly our goal.
A final sort of it's a question, but it's more like it's a reflection. I'm going to read again from the article we mentioned earlier, where you write, "There is nothing left to say. Maybe that is the point, to render us speechless. Who does not feel paralyzed? And maybe that too is the point, to paralyze us. Who is not traumatized? And maybe that too was planned. Nothing we do, it seems, can halt the killing. We feel defenseless. We feel helpless. Genocide is spectacle. I have stopped looking at the images, the rows of little shrouded bodies, the decapitated men and women, families burned alive in their tents, the children who have lost limbs or are paralyzed, the chalky death masks of those pulled from under the rubble, the walls of grief, their emaciated faces. I can't. This genocide will haunt us. It will echo down history with the force of a tsunami. It will divide us forever. There is no going back." You've obviously covered many things in your life, and a lot of them heartbreaking and sad and tragic and, cause to make one very cynical about the world. What have you learned in the last 20 months about sort of human, the human being and the human psyche?
I mean, this only confirmed what I've known. I've been in war, a lot of war, But I think the big change is that this really severs the global north from the global south, that these industrialized nations in the global north have been exposed for who they are. There's no going back. We can't argue that we care about human rights or democracy or can act as the world's policeman. All these tropes that are fed to justify empire and foreign intervention, they won't work anymore. And I think many in the global south, who, to be clear, have suffered holocausts of their own, whether that's in Kenya, whether that's in India, the Armenian genocide. And of course, these holocausts were never recognized. As Ami Cesari in Discourse on Colonialism points out, the reason the Jewish Holocaust, the Holocaust by the Nazis, is held up because it was all of the mechanisms that were used by colonists against, in his words, the coolies in India and the blacks in Africa and the Algerians by the French in Algeria were used on white people. But they're not new. But those Holocausts are at best a footnote. They're not even acknowledged by their perpetrators. I mean, the Germans in Namibia, for instance, with Herero and Namakwa. And I think with the breakdown of the climate and with increasing numbers of climate refugees, the message that the genocide in Gaza imparts, in particular to the global south, is that we can do this to you. We will stop at nothing. And as the climate breaks down, as these countries in the global north become climate fortresses, I think many in the global south correctly see the genocide as a kind of template for what will be done to them. And I don't think at this point there's any going back. I don't think Israel or the United States, or for that matter the UK or Germany, can resurrect themselves. The visage, the mask has been ripped off, and we are seen for who we are. I mean, that's not a surprise, of course, to Native Americans in the United States or African Americans who, of course, suffered their own Holocausts and genocides. But I think now that's self-evident throughout the whole world.
Chris Hedges, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your decades of writing and broadcasting and everything else.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.